Hi, welcome back to Philosophy 101 from Honolulu Community College. I am Chrisanne Moore. So we are now on program 18, and today we're going to talk about Immanuel Kant. So, we have been speeding through history, and as we have been speeding through history, we have been looking at moral theories and ethical controversies. We have looked at what philosophy is, what morality is. We have looked at how to answer moral issues, how to make moral determinations. We've looked at what are the inadequate answers, what are the best possible answers. And then we began to look at different concepts of morality in different cultures and at different times. We looked at moral theory from the perspective of Taoism, Buddhism, from the Sophists, cultural relativists, through Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, through the Hellenistic world, into the domination of the Catholic Church for 1,000 years and the establishment of a Judeo-Christian ethics. Then the natural law theory, the ethics that arose out of the Catholic Church in the High Middle Ages. And then we talked about the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and we've begun to talk about the rebirth of philosophy. Because really, during the 1,000-year domination of the Catholic Church over the Western mind, there was very little philosophy done. The Catholic Church was in total control of existential questions, or the answers to existential questions. The answers were considered to be arrived at by faith alone and by the interpretation of revelation by the authorities of the Church. Now, as we've looked at these theories over time, we have also been exploring ethical controversies, particularly through the films that you've been watching. You saw Warrior Marks, a film about the Somali practice of female genital mutilation, and needed to ask yourself, is morality dependent on culture? And do members of outside cultures have a right to say whether a culture's practices are right or wrong? And of course, you realize by now there's no easy answer to that question. We also, when exploring Judeo-Christian ethic, had to confront where the virtues of charity and forgiveness fit into our own personal idea of morality. Because, of course, a big part of this show is you developing your moral theory. You are learning all these moral theories so that you have this vocabulary, these tools to understand how to solve ethical controversies and moral dilemmas. But it is ultimately your moral theory that counts. And so as you are developing your moral theory through this course, where do charity and forgiveness fit in? Does one only need to care for their own happiness? Or does one need to care about only for the happiness those they love, those around them? How far does that circle extend? Or does it extend to the suffering stranger? And then, as we move through natural law theory, you saw that out of the Judeo-Christian ethic and out of natural law theory came very definite ideas of what the morality of sexuality is. Natural law theory definitely says that sexuality, the final purpose of sexuality, is procreation, which Aquinas says must be within a lifelong marriage between a man and a woman. So you had to confront, in a sense, what you believe about sexuality and what you believe about procreation by watching the film Trave. The film Trave simply presents the lives of a lesbian couple and their own confrontation with their tradition, their religion, their culture. And where is the moral determination for you on that issue? After natural law, we saw that once again, ethics returned to the domination of the Church. But through the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution, as we discussed last time, the world had changed. After the Reformation, the Catholic Church no longer had singular control over religion and philosophy in the West. The Protestant religions were formed. And now one needed to decide on one's religion. Through the scientific revolution, a scientific method had been discovered which was allowing for incredible discoveries of the laws of nature, of how they worked. actually mind-blowing new views of the universe and how it functioned. And these discoveries made life better. The scientific method had brought knowledge that worked. And because of the scientific revolution, and because of the Reformation, where there were now all sorts of different religions, and because of the bloody conflict that arose because of all these different religions fighting with one another, oppressing one another, persecuting one another, some people realized that philosophy was once again necessary. Philosophy was necessary to try to figure out the great existential questions. Who am I? How do I live? What do I do? Simple, huge, inescapable questions. And yet, many people have looked to religion alone for generations to answer those questions. But the bloody conflicts between religions and the persecutions made religion appear to some less and less a secure place to look for answers to existential questions. But even those who were still religious, they now had to decide on which religion. There wasn't one singular answer handed down from authority. One had to decide which religion. And some of those religions expected the individual to read the sacred book, in the West in most cases the Bible, and determine what that book meant, to interpret that book for themselves, which of course requires reasoning. Furthermore, as science discovered more and more natural laws, discoveries that worked, that made life better, it seemed that the human mind and human reason should be able to discover philosophical truths. That we should not necessarily be dependent on revelation, that we should not necessarily be dependent on trying to discover God's will because it was becoming more and more clear. That is extraordinarily difficult, even for those who believe in God. We have human reason. We have a natural world around us to apply that reason to. Shouldn't we be able to, using our own hearts and minds and feelings and imagination and critical thinking, be able to determine the answers to how to live our own lives? And really, out of that confrontation, philosophy is reborn. After the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution, around the beginning of the 17th century, the sometime the scientific revolution is taking off. And so people once again turn to philosophy, to this idea of reasoning, striving and struggling for one's own answers. But of course, when one begins to look for answers philosophically, one needs a method. How does one answer these great questions? How does one know what is moral? How does one know what is good? How does one answer the question, why should I be good? Who should I care about? What should I do? A method. Well, we've seen since chapters 2 and chapter 3 that most of those who are looking for a moral theory are trying to answer the question, what is good for all human beings? This idea comes from the notion that if something is true, it is universally true. In other words, if it's true for me, it's true for you. If it's truly true for you, it's true for me. If it's wrong in one culture, it's wrong in another culture. If slavery is wrong in my culture, slavery is wrong in your culture. If it's wrong for me to lie, it's wrong for you to lie. If it's wrong for you to steal, it's wrong for me to steal. But how do we discover and prove these universal truths through philosophy? We need a method. Now, as we've seen since the beginning as well, philosophy uses two basic methods, that of logic or reason, deductive logic, or experience, inductive logic. But both of these are flawed because deductive logic, in order to arrive at universal truth, needs to begin with a priori ideas, needs to begin with certain, self-evident, undoubtable ideas. And then when we apply logic, we can arrive at other universal truths. Experience, of course, is flawed because experience is always my experience. Or even if I compile the experience of thousands of people, experience is always limited. It is always relative to the individual, and it indeed can be deceptive. So once again, in the 17th century, we were back to the conundrum, the dilemma of needing to discover a philosophical method to arrive at certain truth. If religion and revelation presents problems, well, so does philosophy. Now, two schools arose in an attempt to answer this problem, in an attempt to create this method. The first we discussed a little bit about last time, rationalism. Those who believe that deductive and logic indeed could arrive at certain universal truth. Rationalists, believe that a priori ideas do indeed exist, undoubtable, self-evident, universal truths, which we can discover and know, apply logic, and arrive at universal truth. These are called the rationalists. Universal truth can be deduced by applying deductive logic to self-evident first principles called a priori ideas. Of course, there's a difficulty with rationalism, as again we've seen from the beginning, how to prove that a priori ideas exist and how to know exactly what they are. The problem with rationalism: it is difficult to discover a priori ideas. It is difficult to prove they exist. Now, as we saw way back with Socrates and Plato, when they were trying to refute the sophists, trying to refute relativism, Plato and Socrates determined that a priori ideas exist in a transcendental realm. Indeed, Socrates and Plato believed in reincarnation, and therefore they believed that we experienced these a priori ideas as forms in a transcendental world. And then when we are born into this world, we forget them. But we know them inside ourselves, and we can discover them. Socrates, through remembering our soul, through remembering what nurtures our soul. And Plato, through looking at different manifestations of the forms in this world, different forms of imperfect justice, we can remember justice. Different forms of imperfect love, we can remember love itself. But of course, by the time we get to the 17th century, the West people do not believe in reincarnation. Although much of what Plato wrote and Socrates taught is still accepted in the West, the idea of reincarnation was not. So establishing a priori ideas through this concept of reincarnation was no longer workable, was no longer available. So how to find these a priori ideas? Well, this is a problem. And as we talked about last time, René Descartes began to develop a method to discover a priori ideas. In his book, Discourses on the Method, published in 1638, he thought that if he doubted everything that it was possible to doubt, what would be left would be an undoubtable idea. If something could be doubted just a little bit, then you must throw it out. You must discard it. You must find that one idea which is absolutely undoubtable. And as we saw in the last program, Descartes did find one idea that was absolutely undoubtable. And that was the fact that he was doubting. Amazing. I cannot doubt that I am doubting. Therefore, I cannot doubt that I am thinking. And therefore, I cannot doubt that I exist. And so Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Amazing, but controversial. Because really, this one a priori idea, this one undoubtable truth, I think, therefore I am, doesn't lead anywhere. Descartes found that in order to really use logic on this one a priori idea to get any new ideas of meaning, Descartes found he had to prove the existence of God. And we will not follow Descartes' proof for the existence of God. We will suffice it to say that Descartes' discovery of the a priori idea was unsatisfactory to most. And so his project, though brilliant and world-changing in his method, ultimately did not recover philosophy the way it needed to be recovered. Now, there was another school of philosophy, however, that thought we could find knowledge through experience. In fact, this school, the empiricists, believe that all knowledge comes from experience. They believe there was no such thing as a priori ideas. In fact, they claim that when one says they have discovered an a priori idea, all they are saying is, my truth is undoubtable. So, the empiricists throw out the concept of a priori ideas, say that we are born actually nothing but a blank slate, and all our knowledge comes from our experiences. Empiricism, belief that experience is the source of all knowledge. Well, you may realize, of course, that this position is problematic, as we have said from the beginning, because, as I said, the problem with empiricism is experience is limited, relative, and can be deceptive. We've talked about this again and again, so it should be very clear to you. So, can empirical knowledge be used to find universal truth? No, it would seem no, it cannot be. And by the time of the 17th century, other problems with using experience as a source of knowledge became more apparent. As the empiricists wrote and published, the flaws in their method became even clearer. You see, if we are born a blank slate and all we know is what we experience, certain problems arise that may be a bit difficult to understand, but if you take a moment, let's look at this cup. I am looking at this cup, I am sensing this cup, I am now experiencing this cup. But where am I experiencing it? Where do I see this cup? Do I see it out there? No, in matter of fact, what I see in my mind. Now, where is mind? We don't know, really. But we imagine our mind to be somewhere behind our eyes, simply because that's where we locate sight. But nevertheless, where I see this cup is in my mind. I don't see it out here. Really, what I'm seeing is light hitting the cup, entering my irises, hitting my cornea, being translated into neurochemicals moving through my nervous system to my brain, being translated onto an image which is reflected onto my mind, which then makes it appear like it's out here. Think about this for a second. It may seem confusing at first, but if you think about it for a moment, it is obviously true. My sight is happening in my mind. You see, all I ever experience is in my mind. I can't experience anything outside of my mind. So empiricism leaves a problem. Because if all I ever experience are ideas in my own mind, how can I really verify what is happening outside of my mind? What does this cup really look like before I see it on my mind screen? Even more so, how can I know what's inside anyone else's mind? What do you see when you look at this cup? I can't go inside your mind and see what you see. Now, we both look at that and we call it red. We call it red because since we were little, when someone pointed to this color, they said red. So whenever we see this color, we say red. But I don't know what red looks like inside your mind. I don't know what red looks like to you. I can't get inside your mind. In fact, this is what is called the ego-centric predicament. If I am born a blank slate, and all I ever experience are ideas in my own mind, how can I verify anything outside my mind? And how can I know what is in anyone else's mind? How can there be any such thing as universal truth? Because in fact, your experiences are completely different from my experiences. I don't know what it was like to be raised in your family. You don't know what it was like to be raised in my family. I don't know what it was like to be in the kindergarten you were in. You don't know what it was like to be in the kindergarten I was in. Our experiences are vastly different. So how can we discover universal truths from vastly different experiences, from limited experiences, and from experiences that we only perceive in our own mind? You see, this is called the ego-centric predicament. I see a cup. I assume that what I see in my mind, on the screen in my mind, is the same as what is out there. But the truth is, I don't know what's out there. I only know what I see in my mind. Further than that, I don't know what's in your mind. And so we end up in the ego-centric predicament. If all you ever experience are ideas in your own mind, how can you verify what exists outside your mind? Or ever know what is in anyone else's mind? You can't. Now, there's no doubt you're probably going to have to think about this. It's not something you can just run over and get immediately. So read about this in your text and then give some thought to it. And you will discover that it is indeed true, that to an extent, you are bound within your own mind. Only you can know your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own perceptions. You can't ever really know anyone else's. Not the specifics. Sure, you can communicate, but we have this awkward, strange thing called vocabulary that we have to shove all that into and then communicate and hope that the other person translates it in such a way that they understand. If you've ever been really, really in love, you understand the egocentric predicament, because at some point you realize you can only get so close. We are bound by our skin, but even more so, we are bound in our minds, in our own perceptions. In a sense, we are alone in our own minds, knowing only what we see and what we feel, and being trapped by the needs for words and gestures to try to communicate it to the other. And so often, our communications fail, which is why our relationships fail so often. So, rationalism has failed to give us a priori ideas which are meaningful, or at least we can agree on. And empiricism, or experience, leaves us trapped in our own mind in an egocentric predicament. So where's philosophy getting us? It's amazing that we are still talking about philosophy. But the fact is, philosophy was recovered by Immanuel Kant, who we'll talk about today. And the reason Immanuel Kant began on this quest is because one empirical philosopher really made him a set. There was one empiricist who took empiricism, the idea that experience is a source of all knowledge, to its logical extreme. This empiricist's name was David Hume. And David Hume, on his treatise on human understanding, proposed that if indeed we are born a blank slate, and if indeed all of our knowledge comes from our sense experiences, then really all meaningful ideas should be able to be traced back to sense experience. So if an idea has meaning, I should be able to trace back the experience that that idea came from. Of course, we have many ideas that do not come from experience. For instance, you may have an image of a flying horse. And you, of course, have never experienced a flying horse. Or if you have, let me know in an email. But most people have not experienced flying horses. Where does that idea come from? It comes from our imagination. Our imagination has put together our sense experience of a horse and our sense experience of birds and compile them into this imaginative, creative idea. The mind is incredibly creative. But these creative ideas are not meaningful ideas. Hume is saying that the meaningful ideas can be traced back to sense experience. But this causes an enormous dilemma, because there are many ideas which human beings hold to be of incredible importance which cannot be traced back to sense experience. I'd like you for a moment to try to trace back to sense experience your idea of an I. We all have this idea that we are I's. I's. In other words, that I exist as a continuous self over time. That I am somehow the same person who went to kindergarten. That I am somehow today the same person who grew up in my family. But how is that true? In what way am I the same as the girl who went to kindergarten? We certainly don't have the same body. We certainly don't have the same thoughts. We don't have the same way of thinking. We don't have the same feelings. So what is the same between Chris-Anne today and the little blonde, toothless girl who went off to kindergarten? We think there's something the same, but what is it? Whatever it is, it cannot be found in sense experience. Now, you may have to trust me on this at first, but if you have some time and want to do an interesting thought experiment, try to trace your sense of a continuous self over time to sense experience. You won't be able to. Or if you are able to, write and let me know, and we'll do a great philosophical paper together and become very famous. Because nobody's been able to trace I back to a sense experience. What's another idea that many people cherish that cannot be traced back to sense experience? The idea of God. The idea of God cannot be traced back to a sense experience. God didn't show up in your room one night and you shook his hand or shook her hand, right? You didn't see God running across a field lately, did you? There was no sense experience which you can trace this idea of God back to. Another idea that you cannot trace back to sense experience is morality. What we are dealing with in this course. David Hume points out that, for instance, if you saw a murder, where would you see the evil in the murder? What sense experience would lead you to think that there was evil there? It's not traceable to a sense experience. Nor if you saw a great act of charity, someone saving a stranger's life and risking their own. Where is the good in that? What sense experience can you find the good in? You can't. Hume went so far as to say morality is just a matter of feelings. It's just a matter of human sentiment. Really, morality is something more like taste. We find evil in a murder because we find the murder distasteful. We find goodness in self-sacrifice because that gives us feelings of goodness. But these feelings are not sense experience. Hume says that morality appears to be universal because humans are similar in their makeup, and therefore we have similar feelings in similar situations. But morality really is just a feeling, the way we feel about something. So, this idea that all meaningful ideas must be traced back to sense experience means we have to throw out some of our most cherished ideas. Let's look at that. Some ideas that cannot be traced back to sense experience include God, morality, and I. Wow, it seems that both rationalism leaves us trapped in our own mind knowing one thing, that we think and therefore we are, which isn't incredibly helpful. And empiricism leaves us in the ego-centric predicament, having to throw out some of our most cherished ideas because they can't be traced back to experience. I, God, and morality. And it would seem at this point that why is there philosophy at all if it's getting us absolutely nowhere but confusing and asking us to understand that cups don't look like cups and red doesn't look like red? And why do people do philosophy anyway? It kind of gives you a headache after a while when you really try to expand your mind that much. I know. It's well worth a try, though. Keep going. Well, one of the reasons philosophy still exists and is meaningful is because our philosopher today, Immanuel Kant, solved this problem between rationalism and empiricism. He solved it by saying that rational and empiricism are both right. He solved it by discovering a priori ideas. A priori ideas much more meaningful than I think, therefore I am. A priori ideas which will actually give us a basis to develop a logical, rational understanding of morality. It really was an incredible feat. And Immanuel Kant, because of this, has had an impact, an enormous impact on philosophy and psychology and art and literature and science in every aspect. Immanuel Kant was born in 1724 and he died in 1804. So his life spanned the 18th century. The age of reason, and in some ways Immanuel Kant is the apotheosis, the icon of the age of reason, because he really recovers rationality and logic as ways of knowing, of universal knowing, of determining universal truth. Before that, though, Immanuel Kant's life was really quite settled. As a matter of fact, most biographers speak of Immanuel Kant. They say that he was remarkable in the fact that he was so unremarkable. He was born in Königsberg, which was then Prussia, and he pretty much never traveled more than 60 miles from the place he was born. He studied philosophy. He became a professor. At first he was a lecturer. Actually, he was a lecturer in philosophy for 17 years, which meant that his living was dependent on the number of students he had. Instead of being paid by the university, he was paid by the number of students that came to his class. He was, however, an extremely successful lecturer. He was very popular and his classes filled. And eventually he became a full professor at the university, but it took many years. He never married. He lived a very quiet, very regulated life. As a matter of fact, it is told in, I think, every biography of Kant you will read, that the citizens of Königsberg could set their watches by his 3 o'clock walk, because every day at 3 o'clock, Immanuel Kant would go outside with his manservant and walk up and down the boulevard of Königsberg like clockwork. And so this quiet, settled, unremarkable life went on until Immanuel Kant read David Hume. And when Immanuel Kant read David Hume, he became incensed, he became furious, and he became deeply concerned. See, Immanuel Kant was basically very pious. He had grown up in a pietist household. Pietism is a sect of Protestantism, which is somewhat similar to the Quakers in the United States, but a very strict pietist upbringing. And Immanuel Kant had deep belief in morality. And yet when he read David Hume's treatise on human understanding, he realized with horror that David Hume was making sense. If indeed we are born a blank slate, then all meaningful ideas would be able to be traced back to sense experience. And it is true that I and God and morality cannot be traced back to sense experience. And so, if Hume is correct, we do have to throw out these ideas. If Hume is correct, we are indeed stuck in the ego-centric predicament. But this was utterly unacceptable to Kant. First of all, it seemed that these ideas, God and I and morality, are indeed universal ideas. And if they don't come from sense experience, they must come from somewhere. And on top of that, science was working. By the 18th century, science was making astounding discoveries. As a matter of fact, in 1724, as Kant was being born, As Kant was being born, Newton was dying. By the time of 1804, when Kant was dying, the United States had already been born. The French Revolution had already occurred. As a matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson had just signed the Louisiana Purchase. In this 18th century, rationalism and science were making differences in the world. So Hume must be wrong, because science does indeed work. And it couldn't if we are so trapped in our individual experience. So Kant determined to discover a priori ideas. We cannot be born a blank slate. There must be universal ideas shared by all human beings. And there must be a universal morality based on those shared ideas. And so, Immanuel Kant spent the next 10 years of his life searching for these and writing his critique of pure reason. Critique meaning critical analysis, and pure reason meaning reason divorced from experience, pure reason alone. And Kant did find a priori ideas, and he found them in the most remarkable place. He found them in the way the mind structures experience. You see, my experiences may be very different from your experiences. Indeed, they are different from your experiences. All of our individual experiences are different, but all of us, our minds structure experience in the same way. Now, this is a complex idea, and we're going to break it down step by step to try to give you an idea. But if you're willing to explore, if you're willing to think, I think you'll begin to understand what Immanuel Kant was talking about. So, in order to begin to understand Kant, what I would like you to do is, once again, let's do our watching our thoughts experiment. We've done this before. I'm simply going to ask you to close your eyes and watch your thoughts as they arise. Just take note of your thoughts, whether it's I'm hungry, or I wish I wasn't watching this TV show, or I have no idea what she's saying. Just watch your thoughts. After you watch your thoughts, about a minute or so, I'm going to ask you to write down 2 of those thoughts. Any 2 of those thoughts. It doesn't really matter. Okay, let's start. Close your eyes. No, don't watch me. Close your eyes. Watch your thoughts. Okay. Write down any 2 thoughts. If you didn't have enough time, stop the tape, do the exercise, and then turn me back on. Okay. You should have written down 2 thoughts. Again, if you didn't have enough time, just stop your tape and write them down. Okay. Now, it should seem apparent that the 2 thoughts you wrote down are going to be different, probably, than anyone else's thoughts. Or even more apparent that you don't know what anybody else wrote down. You don't know what anybody else who is watching this show right now, or who has ever taken this class, wrote down. Right? Those thoughts are completely individual. They are completely from your own head. They are completely yours, and other people's thoughts are completely theirs. There is no way to know someone else's thoughts for sure, which is probably a good thing. But what's astounding, what Immanuel Kant realized, and what you will soon realize, is that every thought of anyone who has ever done this exercise and written down their thoughts, in fact, every thought that has ever been thought, has certain features in common. And though I may not know what you wrote down, And you may not know what anyone else wrote down. I can assure you that those thoughts have certain things in common. The structure of every thought is the same. The structure of your thought is the same as the structure of the thought of everyone who's ever taken this class. The structure is the same as my thoughts. In fact, if there's someone in the deepest, darkest jungles of New Guinea right now thinking, their thought has the same structure as your thoughts. Every thought has this structure. In fact, the two different thoughts you wrote down, they may be completely different thoughts. They have made completely different content, but the structure of the thoughts will be the same. Look at the two things you wrote down and think about what is the same between those two thoughts. What is the structure that those thoughts share? Well, first of all, there's an I there. Every thought contains an I. Whatever you wrote down, whether it's I am hungry, or I'm confused, or I don't know what she's talking about, or I think this is a stupid exercise, whatever you wrote down, it has an I. Whatever any student who has ever done this course has written down has an I. And whatever anyone is thinking, whether in New York or Guam or Nairobi or New Guinea, it has an I. You see, I cannot be traced back to sense experience, but I is fundamental to every thought. I is the way we structure our thoughts and experiences. We don't say there's hunger going on. We say, I am hungry. We don't say there is a roller coaster ride happening. We say, I am having a roller coaster ride. Every experience, every feeling that we have, we locate in an I. And it's not traceable to sense experience. You see, I is an a priori idea. I is the way we structure thought and experience. So now we're beginning to see a priori ideas do not come from experience. They are the way our mind structures experience. So we can begin to find a priori ideas by looking at the way our mind structures experience. Let's look for another of those a priori ideas. The way we can find them is by finding those things without which thought itself becomes impossible. Look about the room you were in. Now I want you to take a moment and imagine that room without furniture. It should be fairly easy. Now I'd like you to imagine that room without people. You can imagine a room emptied of furniture and people. Imagine that room without light. You should be able to imagine a room emptied of light. Now I would like you to imagine that room without space. Can't do it, right? You cannot imagine no space. Try. If you try to imagine nothing, what you will imagine is empty space. Now, again, this may take a little effort, and it is going to take a bit of effort to understand Immanuel Kant, but it's well worth the effort. Try to imagine no space. You can't. You can imagine empty space, you can imagine everything collapsing to a point, but there's still space. Because your mind cannot think without space. Every experience is placed in space. Every experience occurs in space. Every thought presumes the existence of space. Further than that, every thought presumes and every experience presumes the existence of three-dimensional space. Everything I experience, let's take my famous cup. I see this cup in 3 dimensions. It has height, it has width, and it has depth. Height, width, depth. Everything I experience has height, width, and depth. Now, I don't know what this cup looks like outside my mind. If you remember our picture, I don't know that this cup is exactly three-dimensional. I know that when my mind sees it, it is seen in 3 dimensions. You see, I cannot envision anything other than 3 dimensions. It may be outside, out there is 11 dimensions. As we've said before, physicists and mathematicians, they take mathematical calculations that envision the world, not envision, that require a world of 11 dimensions, but it cannot be envisioned. We cannot see that way. Not yet. Anything that comes into our mind is put into a 3-dimensional framework. What is seen back here is 3-dimensional. Space. 3-dimensional space is an a priori idea. No matter what your thought is, no matter what my thought is, no matter what the thought of somebody standing on the top of the World Trade Center right now, can't believe I said World Trade Center, Empire State Building, is going to see 3-dimensional space. So 3-dimensional space is an a priori idea by which our mind structures experience and thought. Now let's look at one more. Pick something up in your room. Pick anything up in your room. Hold it. Is it still in your hand? Still? Still? It may seem quite obvious, but you're experiencing that as occurring over time. We've talked about this before with Lao Tzu and with Buddha, that thought happens in time, and thought is of time. All thought is structured by time. We experience things as happening over time. We cannot experience them any other way. As a matter of fact, we experience things as happening in forward moving time. We cannot imagine or even think about any other kind of time, really. I know that I can put this cup down, but I also know I cannot go back and have never picked it up. I can put the cup down, but once I pick the cup up, I cannot go back and have never picked it up. Our actions are irrevocable. Time moves only forward, at least in our minds. We don't know really out there. Time may be simultaneous. Time may move backward and forward. If you're a science fiction reader, wonderful scientific novels have played with the concept of time, traveling in time, moving backward in time, moving forward in time. But you always run into something called the temporal paradox, that eventually the mind cannot conceive of the consequences because nothing but forward moving time makes sense to us. For instance, think, could you go back in time and prevent your own birth? Could you do something and go back in time to prevent your own birth? Just play with that idea. Well, of course you couldn't, because if you prevent your own birth, you can't be there to go back and prevent it. So how would that work? Temporal paradoxes. This is why people who watch Star Trek always have an easier time in philosophy, because Star Trek plays with these concepts all the time. People who read science fiction play with notions in philosophy. That is why so many philosophers like science fiction, including me. So, let's look at this. As each thought and experience comes into our mind, it is shaped by the filters of our mind, like dough is shaped as it moves through a cookie cutter. Immanuel Kant discovered a priori ideas and recovered philosophy from meaninglessness. The a priori ideas he discovered was the way that our mind shapes thought and experience. Like dough through a cookie cutter, my mind shapes every thought and every experience that comes into it before I perceive it on the screen of my mind. Or imagine if I took lace and I shined a flashlight through that lace. what would appear on the other side would be shaped by the lace pattern. And that is what our mind does with thought. If you think of thought as light through lace, the lace pattern, the thoughts are patterned by the thing it moves through. Think of light going through a lace pattern. What appears on the other side is patterned by the lace. The same as thoughts and experience come into our mind, what appears on the screen of mind is patterned by the thought that it moves through. Our mind, in essence, contains a filter. We might image it something like this. There is a filter in our mind that structures all thought and experience. The noumenal world, as Kant called it, is the world as it is, the unfiltered world, the world out there, the world before we perceive it. But once it goes through our filter, we perceive the world as it is filtered, as it is structured, and this is called the phenomenal world. Now let's look at those filters. We've talked about three-dimensional space is one of those filters. It may be 11 dimensions out there, but we perceive in 3 dimensions. Forward-moving time. Time may be simultaneous or moving backwards and forward. There may be all sorts of different movements of time, but we perceive forward-moving time. And we perceive everything in terms of an I, a self, a continuous self that exists over time. These are structures. Now, Immanuel Kant then went forward and talked about many different filters. He called them regulative categories. There are others that we don't want to go into or need to go into for this course. But there is one important filter that is essential in this course, and that of this course, morality. You see, Hume is right. Hume had said morality cannot be found in sense experience. And it cannot be. So, morality must be an a priori idea because we do experience in terms of morality. Everything that we experience as good or bad, correct or incorrect, right or wrong. So morality must be a component of rationality. Morality must be one of those filters in our mind, one of those structures in our mind. Morality itself is an a priori idea, part of the structure of our mind, part of the way we organize thought and experience, universal in all human beings. Just as all human beings think in terms of I, all human beings structure their experience in terms of 3-dimensional space, all human beings think in terms of forward-moving time. All human beings share morality as a component of their filter, as an aspect of rationality. It's part of our hardware. We are not born a blank slate. We are not born a tabula rasa. We are born with definite a priori ideas. And those a priori ideas structure every thought and every experience we have. Morality is one of those a priori ideas. Why? Morality cannot be traced back to experience. And yet, as Immanuel Kant pointed out, no one wants to live in a world without morality. Amazing, but true. No one wants to live in a world without morality. Now, granted, not everybody wants to be moral, but even immoral people want you to be moral. Even people who want to lie, cheat, and steal want everybody else to be honest. Even those who break contracts expect you to keep your contracts. You see, even the immoral want everybody to be moral. No one wants to live in a world without morality, for indeed it would be unlivable. Therefore, if everyone has this idea of morality, it cannot be traced back to sense experience. It must be an a priori idea. But unlike Socrates and Plato, who said that that idea then must come from a transcendental world we experienced before we were born, Kant says, no, it is a structure of our mind. It is one of the filters of our mind. And because morality is a component of rationality, because it is a structure that we are born with, we can now take this a priori idea, apply logic, and determine universal moral truth. And so, That is why philosophy is still so important in being studied. And next episode, we will look at this idea that morality is a component of rationality, apply logic to it as Kant did, and come up with a universal objective moral theory, Kant's ethics, which are considered by many to be one of the most important ethical theories of all time. And we will find a step-by-step method to apply to our ethical controversies and moral dilemmas. Now, these were a lot of complicated ideas. Don't worry if you didn't get it the very first time I said it. Don't worry if it's not all immediately apparent. You're going to have to think about this. You're going to have to read. You wanted to strive and struggle for your own answers? Well, here's the time to do it. You got to think about these things. But they will become clear. It happens every semester. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.